Howdy y'all, hope you're all doing well. In the last video I gave an introduction to my channel and also shared a few tips on how to be successful in programming and discussed what the future of the programming will be like. In today's video, I will cover the key differences between the DDL, DML, DCL and TCL commands in SQL. This will be the first of the SQL series videos. So without wasting any time, let's jump right in and look at the key differences first. So DDL is data definition language, DML is data manipulation language, DCL is data control language, and TCL is transactional control language. So what do they mean? So basically, DDL is used to create or modify the database structure. So by database structures, I mean it can be tables, views, stored procedures, etc. DML is used to select and manipulate the data. So the data that's been accessed here is actually accessed from the structures created by the DDL. But select can also sometimes be called as data query language. Data control language or DCL is used to control access using roles and permissions. Transactional control language is used to manage transactions. The commands used by DDL are create, alter, drop, truncate, and rename. So rename, I've given a star here primarily because you have to be very cautious when using it. For example, when you rename a table, the table can be used by a stored procedure or a function or many of them. Obviously, when you rename the table, the function itself will be successful, but there might be some other issues with your database because obviously your stored procedures or other objects are still using the old table name. In DML, the commands used can be select, insert, update, and delete. And in DCL, it's grants and revoke. And in TCL, it's commit, rollback, and save transaction. Now that you know the key differences, let's look at each of these commands in action. I will attach the link to these scripts to the in the description below. So if you want to play around later, and if you have any questions, ask them in the comment section below. So let's start off with the DDL commands. So usually you'll see a pattern that each of these commands are written in a manner where you start off with the actual command name and then you specify what object you're performing that action on. Sorry, when I say what object, I mean what type of object. And in some cases, obviously, you can check if the object exists or not, specifically in the case of a drop. And obviously, you need to specify a name of the object as well. So if you start off with drop, so drop table, if exist, dbo.customer, obviously this is dropping the table or removing the table from the database, but it's only doing it if the table exists. Now, if I remove that and I execute that, I'll get an error, primarily because the table doesn't exist. So if I add back the if exists now and execute that, it won't error now. So that's because if exists is checking if the table already exists. If it does, it will drop it. If it doesn't, then it'll exit successfully. So this if exists is a feature that's provided in SQL Server 2016 or later. However, the older versions of the SQL Server, you can still achieve that in a different way. However, the script is a bit longer than this neat little script. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So one thing that I'd like to point out here is when I'm mentioning the table names, I'm always using a DBO dot. So DBO is basically the schema name that I've used to create the database. So this is the default schema that comes with your SQL Server. However, you can create custom schemas. However, I'm not going to go into that detail in this video. If you need me to cover that, please add your comments into the comment section. Having said that, it doesn't always mean that you'd always have to use DBO. So I can basically run this without the DBL and it'll still work. So that is basically the drop table. So if I move forward into the create table section, again, it's following the same pattern as earlier. So you'd have a command, you have your object type, table, and you have an object name. So dbo.customer. And then you mention your columns that are required in your table. So the format again for the column names is columns is the column name followed by your data type, and you specify whether it's nullable or not. Basically, by that we mean that if I don't pass in a value into this table for a particular column, and if it's nullable, it'll insert null into those columns. Obviously, if it's not nullable, then the script will fail because you have not passed anything, or you passed null into the script. Apart from all these four columns, I've created this as a primary key. So as you can see from the constraint I've placed here, this customer ID is now a primary key. The identity is only specified here because I don't want to create new references each time I insert rows into this table. I don't want to create new references each time, or new unique references, I should say. This identity will, by default, increment the value each time a new row is inserted. So we will see that in due time in the later section of this video. So let's now execute that script. So this should now create the table. Then if I execute that, obviously there will be no rows here, but then at least you can see that it doesn't throw me an error. Now, obviously I'm using a command here to select from the database, from the table, but don't worry about that. I'll cover about these in the next scripts. So the next section is to rename the table. So the current table name I've used is customer. Yeah, that's all good, isn't it? But what if, I find out, okay, later I need to rename it for some reason. So obviously there is a script that you can use to rename the table name itself. However, I have to mention that you have to be very cautious when you're doing this, as I said earlier, because when you change the table name, there might be other objects that are referencing this table name. Obviously, they will be corrupted, or they will throw out an error whenever you call them, because now your table name has been changed. So to execute it, again, you can press F5 or just press execute there. So that will execute that and change the name from customer to customer 2. So if I select a start from customer 2 now, I can see that, yep, it's changed the name. And if I select start from the old table name, it doesn't actually return anything. And to be honest, it'll throw you an error because the table now doesn't exist. Okay, so but now I don't want I don't want my table to be called customer 2. I just want it customer. So let's put it back. Yeah. All right. So obviously the other thing you've seen earlier was I've named one of the column gender as gender blah. Obviously that's not the right name, isn't it? So in order to name or rename that column name to the right one, I can still use the same methodology, which is exec spd rename. However, in this case, instead of the actual table name, I'm actually saying, okay, the table name dot the column name. And then I'm specifying the new column name. And then I'm specifically saying that, okay, this is a column that I'm changing. So if I execute that executes fine. And now if I run it, I can see that, yep, the gender has changed from gender blah to gender. Yep. So that's all good. All right. I mean, this column name change is quite useful, especially in scenarios where if you've created a table a year in the past and you've created a column there, but then you can see that there's a new functionality that actually came into your application, and now that column can be used for two different purposes, and you want to generalize that column name now. And what better way to just rename the column, because that wouldn't necessarily cause an issue in production data, primarily because the old data can still be there when you rename the column. The only thing you have to keep in mind is obviously any other objects, for example store procedures, functions, views, and any ad hoc queries you may have in your application will be referencing to the old column name. So you'd have to make that conscious effort to go and change those scripts as well. There is a way to find out how if the column name is used in any SPs or store procedures or functions. But again, I won't be covering that in this tutorial. So if you again want me to cover that, please post a comment below. All right. So obviously we've covered rename now. So it's 3 of them done now. And then we have alter table. Okay, what is alter table? Alter table is nothing but if you are making any alterations to your table, that's simplistically. Now, in this case, what I'm showing you an example is, alter table dbo.customer. I'm actually altering the gender column again. In this case, I'm actually increasing the length of the field. So previously I've given a length of 10. Now I'm incrementing that to 20, and I'm keeping it as nullable. So now if I execute it, there will be no difference. If you run that, there will be no difference you see here. But then now if you go into the columns here, and if you refresh, you can see that, okay, the gender now is, back at 20 rather than 10, which is good. All right. So obviously there are other purposes you can use alter table for. For example, you can drop a column within a table using an alter table as well. So if you obviously want me to cover any of these commands in more detail to find out, for example, every possible combination of these commands, then obviously let me know again. I'll try and make sure to make a different video to cover them. Okay, so let's move forward now. So truncate table. So truncate table is where it's simplistically you're truncating your table, which means you're kind of resetting your table. So in our case now, we don't have any rows in our database, or any, to be honest, in the table, and therefore even if you run this will probably make no difference. However, you'll see later in future that once you remove or insert any new rows, and if you rerun this, you'll see that the data has been wiped out, which is simplistically what it's doing. And there is one more difference between truncate and delete. And again, so you might have seen that the I've created this customer ID as identity 1. Now, when I insert 3 different rows into this table, the customer ID will be set to 4 now for the next 4th row that I'm inserting into it. However, when I run if I run truncate here, it will reset that customer ID to 1 back again. However, if I use a delete on that table, that won't reset the customer ID. So the customer ID will still remain as 4 for the next row that will get inserted into that table. So I'll show you a simple example, okay? All right, so I'll show you a simple example in the DML scripts, primarily because you can only insert or manipulate the data if you remember using the DML scripts. So if you're happy with the DDL scripts, let's move on to the DML scripts now. So in the DML scripts, I'm going to cover the insert, select, update, and delete. All right. I'm going to do is Sorry, that obviously errored because I didn't select the database. So this should be all good now. All right, so that says 4 rows affected, which just means it's inserted 4 rows. All right, let's look into the syntax actually. So I'm actually inserting into the customer table I've just created. So simplistically, it's saying insert into the table, and I'm specifying the column names. And in the values section, I can actually set, I'm actually inserting 4 different values. And it's simplistically, it's all intuitive, isn't it? So you have your forename, surname, date of birth, and gender. You'd also notice that, okay, as I said earlier, I'm not actually inserting any values into the customer ID column. And now if I select this table, you can see that customer ID is actually being incremented each time a new row is created, which is well and good, isn't it? So technically, this table or this column is getting values automatically just because I specified it as an identity column. Okay, well and good. Now I want to show you the update feature. So technically, you've already seen the select many a times as well. So I'm kind of guessing you probably don't need that much input into this command. One thing I'd like to point out, though, is when I say select star, obviously it's selecting all the rows. And if I say I only want, for example, the customer ID and the date of birth, I can actually specify the column names here, and it'll only select those two. So this is one thing you need to remember, because in majority of the applications that you build, you won't necessarily need all the columns from that table. For example, if you have 1,000,000 rows in a table, the star will obviously slow your performance of the application, primarily because you're actually extracting a lot amount of data. And if you actually restrict the number of rows to only what you need, number of columns to only what you need, you'll see that, okay, it has a better performance, or relatively better performance, I should say. All right, let's move to an update statement. So update, again, as the command says, you can update a row or a set of rows on a particular table. And the command is as follows. So you say update command, your object name, so in this case, customer. Set is basically, you're saying, okay, I'm going to set these values. So you're saying, okay, I'm going to change the date of birth to 1989 for the customer ID 1, where their date of birth is 1990. So in this case, basically, there's something, a wrong data has been inserted into this table. So all you're saying is, okay, we'll change it now, right? So if you want to see how it is before, so that's before 1990, and now I change it. Now it's changed to 1989. So all good, isn't it? So similarly, as updates the table, deletes rows from the table. Now, one thing I've already shown you before is, truncate does that already. So why do you need truncate and delete? So I'll show you one quick thing now. So if I copy that, and then if I run that, so that's basically saying, okay, I've deleted all the rows from that table. Now, if I run that, obviously there's nothing here. Now, if I insert back the rows on the table again, it says it's created new 4 rows again. But if you notice one thing, so all this data is same, but if you notice the customer ID, so instead of starting at 1, it's starting at 5. That's because delete doesn't actually reset the count of the customer ID. So if I want to reset that, then I need to use truncate. So in this case, if I use truncate, and if I insert the rows again, there you go. I have reset the customer ID. Everything else is the same. So obviously, you can, as with any other query that you've seen here, you can also have a where condition to everything. So in this case, I can actually have a where condition to this delete statement as well. So I'm saying, oh, actually, I don't want the row number 2 here. I just want to delete it. So if I run that, it will say one row is affected. Okay. And if I run that, yep, it's deleted the row number 2. Okay. So that's the DML scripts. Now, let's move on to the DCL scripts. So as I said earlier, DCL is where you control access to the objects that you've created earlier. So in this case, I've created an object called customer, isn't it? So it's a table called customer. Now, there might be scenarios where, okay, your application needs this table. So there is a reason you're creating this table. One is your application needs access to this table to write data into it, or insert or update or delete data into it. Or you need this table for some sort of support purposes where you're extracting data into it overnight, and your application support team needs access to this table so they can actually review what's going on, or if they need anything from a support point of view to help the customers. So for the demo, I've created a temp login. So I've just called it as Techify application support. Now, if you look at the security, you can see that I've created a now support, which is pretty much a role that I've created here as which belongs to the application support group. Now, most of the times you wouldn't necessarily just go into the users and then add new user. There might be scenarios and most likely you'd never actually add an individual user when you're in a company situation, primarily because you're governing the access to these databases through a group. And if you're part of a developers group, for example, then adding a developers group here and adding you as a developer member, then you're by default given the default permissions that were given to any developer on that database, or probably through the whole server. So it's very important to note that you very rarely give an individual access directly. Anyway, I'm kind of diverting from the topic now. So I've created this role now. And to cover off the DCL part, which is the access control. So let's assume, okay, your DB has already given that access maybe, or has already created a role for your application support. Now, if you want to grant access to the table you've newly created now, so the way you do it is, you say grant, and then you say what you're granting. So basically in this case, you're saying, oh, I want to grant the select, insert, update, delete, all these permissions on this object to this role. So this role is nothing but the role you've created here, who is belonging to that Techify application support group. All right. So, okay. So if I run that now, sorry. So it says completed successfully. So that means that person is already, that role has access to this table. Now, if I want to revoke access from that table, primarily because, okay, that support group doesn't exist anymore, or the table doesn't exist anymore. If the table doesn't exist anymore, you can obviously drop a table itself, then remove the permissions. But then if your support group doesn't exist anymore, then, or if you say, okay, this table is too sensitive to share with any other group, then you can basically revoke it by just running a command. All this is doing is it's basically similar to the grant command. The only difference is instead of to using from here, and instead of grant, you say revoke here. Okay, that's well and good. All right, so let's start off with TCL scripts now. So TCL is nothing but a transactional control language where you can manage your transactions. So most of the times your database is set to auto commit. However, there are some scenarios where you might need to manage the transactional scope and either commit or roll back your data or transaction to avoid inconsistencies. So in this case, obviously, I'm going to cover the commit transaction and the rollback transaction, and there's also a save point command. So let's start off with the commit. So usually, whenever you have your transactional scope, you always begin with a begin transaction or begin tran. You can write either of them, begin transaction or begin tran at this point. And then after that, you normally have your update or insert or delete statements. And normally you check consistencies and you either commit or roll back depending on your outcome. So in this case, as a simple example for the commit, I've opened up a transaction, I'm inserting a new row, and I'm checking the rows before the commit, and then I'm committing, and then I'm checking the rows after the commit. So let's first see what rows exist at the moment. So there's 3 rows, 1, 3, and 4. Now, if I go in and begin tran and run this query, so let's run until before the commit. So now I've created a new row called Harry Potter, and I can see that it's inserted it now. And even before the commit, I can see that it's there in that table. Now, the reason for that is basically you're still within the transaction scope. Now, if I take that query and run anywhere outside that scope, you can see that it doesn't return any results, primarily because your table is now locked. So no one actually can access that table because you've kind of put a transactional lock on the table. So that's why you'd have to be careful while running a transactional scopes on your databases or tables. So to release that, I can say, Ashley, I want to commit the data because the data is consistent. So once I commit, I can see that after I run the select query, it's this 4th row that I've inserted is there. The Harry Potter is there. Now, rollback is obviously quite the opposite to commit. It'll roll back the insert or transaction you've done. So in this case, I'm inserting a new row called guess my name. And as before, I'm starting off with the begin tran insert. And let's run the select star from DBO customer again. So as before, since you're within the transactional scope, the new row will be visible in the scope here. Now, if I roll back and do the select again, then you can see that, yep, it's removed the 4th row. Oh, sorry, in this case, the 5th row. All right, so that is the rollback, simplistically. Most of the scenarios, you'd have checks in place to verify the consistency of the data you're inserting or updating or deleting before you run your commit or rollback. So normally you wouldn't just have a simple begin, run, and rollback like this, unless obviously you're testing something. So the next one is save point. All right, so save points are normally created primarily to save your updates until certain point. And these are usually useful, especially in cases where if you, for example, you have 1,000 updates in your script, but these 1,000 updates can be grouped into maybe 4 or 5 different sets, and you want to basically save that set because one set, you can actually validate that one set in one go, and you say, yep, that's all good, so I don't have to roll back to that. Now, so this is a similar example I've taken here. So I've started off with the begin transaction, and I'm updating the table date of birth for the customer ID 3. So in this case, let's say 4. So I'm setting a transaction save point here as with the name A, and I'm doing a select there, that's fine. And I'm inserting a new row there. And after that, I'm setting a transaction save point of B. Now, one thing to know it is you're actually setting a save point after you updated and after you insert, which means this save point already contains that update. So if you roll back to the point of A, you'd have to remember that it doesn't actually remove that, it only removes this. So similarly, if you roll back to the point of B, it doesn't actually remove that because your save point already contains that. Now, let's do that test then. So I'm going to comment out all these selects just to avoid confusion. So let's remove that as well. So the only thing I need now is I want to check before I roll back or after I roll back roll transaction B, what is my point, and after I roll back to transaction A, what's my data look? What does my data look like? So let's run that. Now, I've done 2 updates. One, set the customer ID of 4 date of birth to 1976. Yeah. And second change was, saving that testing save. Now, my first select query was just after the transaction point rollback of B save point, which means obviously the B save point already included that insert. Therefore, the first select query included the row number 5 there, which is testing save. Now the second select query was after the rollback transaction A. So obviously this didn't contain the insert, but it did contain the update. Now if you look at the update for the customer ID 4, so the date of birth is still the same as before, but now I don't have the new row that was inserted here. So obviously all good. But then you'd have to remember that I still am within the scope. So you either have to roll back or commit after this point to actually release the lock from this table. So in this case, I just commit and run the select query. I can see that the date of birth remains there. So we've covered all the different SQL command types now. So hopefully you found this video very useful. And if you'd like to learn more about anything from the SQL series, anything you want me to cover, please obviously post in the comment section below. I'd also be starting off programming or on C# as well as one of the series. So hopefully I'll be able to submit that very soon or start that very soon. As always, if you like this video, please hit the like button and also subscribe to this channel if you'd like to know more about the future videos. And if you want to get notified, also hit the bell icon. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Bye.